Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Texera. I teach in the Department of Sociology. I'm going to be turning the mic over to Jade McDonald in just a moment, but I did have one quick announcement, and that is the chat portion of Zoom. You are not to put your name, nor in the question section, you're not to put your name and your number. We automatically record you when you enter into Zoom. And so you don't have to put it in again. Just wanted to remind you of that. And so with that, I will turn the mic, as I said, over to Jade McDonald, who is a sociology major. I didn't plan that. She's a sociology major and she has something to say. Go ahead, Jade.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Today we have Doug Hartman and Matt Patino talking about midnight basketball. But before we get started, I'm going to read us in our school land acknowledgement. So we recognize that California State University of San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. And now I will pass it over to Matt.
Hi, everybody. I am Matt Patino. I am an MA, first year MA history student here at Cal State. And today I want to welcome everyone to this week's conversation on race and policing. Today, we are speaking with Dr. Douglas Hartman, author of Midnight Basketball, Race, Sports, and Neoliberal Social Policy. The book covers several issues around Midnight Basketball League's questions how the program fell into the more significant national crime and crime prevention conversation. Dr. Hartman is a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota. He received his undergraduate degree in history, yay history, and a master's in social sciences from the University of Chicago. Dr. Hartman received his PhD in sociology from the University of California at San Diego. He's authored 2 editions of Ethnicity and Race, Making Identities in a Changing World, Race, Culture, and the Revolt of the Black Athlete, the 1968 Olympic protests and their aftermath, Migration, Incorporation, and Change in an Interconnected World, and the book we're talking about today, Midnight Basketball, Race, Sports, and Neo-Social Liberal Policy. Dr. Hartman has published a number of articles on race and sports. He is also known for his work on culture, diversity, and inclusion in the United States, and community-engaged research and public sociology. Currently, he's working on his next book, which is tentatively entitled Take a Knee Nation, Athlete Activism, Black Lives Matter, and the Contentious New Politics of Sports in a Divided America. The media has frequently called upon Dr. Hartman to share his insights on the intersection of race, sports, politics, and athlete activism. Welcome, Dr. Hartman.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody who's come. It's exciting to have such a good crowd. And thanks to all those who helped organize this. You guys have a wonderful team, very organized in the backstage here. So it's a pleasure to be part of that. I guess I'll go ahead and screen share if it's okay.
Yes.
My idea here with this event will be, this is the kind of main topic. I'm gonna talk, I think 15 to 20 minutes is my goal. I'll talk about the origins of midnight basketball, some unique characteristics of it, including the racial dimensions, its role in the '94 crime bill, some policy lessons, and then a little bit on contemporary Black athlete activism. My idea is about 20 minutes. Sometimes I say that and it might go a little longer, but I'll try to keep it within that 20-25 minute range so we have plenty of time for questions, comments, discussion, conversations, as the forum series is called. Does that sound okay? Should I go ahead and get started then? All right, I'll take that as a yes. I'll talk about Midnight Basketball. These are the late night basketball-based crime prevention programs that started in the late 1980s and were targeted really towards African-American men living in big major metropolitan areas. These really kind of the idea of Midnight Basketball got started in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is just outside of DC. A former town manager named Dan Standifer was very concerned about late night crime in the Prince George's and greater DC area, and launched the program with that intent to help affect crime and bring social intervention into these troubled neighborhoods. It was kind of got a lot of nice publicity and then got picked up by Jack Kemp and the Chicago Housing Authority. Jack Kemp was then the director of urban housing for the first George Bush presidency. Kemp himself was a former congressman from New York, and before that, a football star. And he was a conservative, kind of traditional free market conservative, but he had a lot of concerns about race and urban social policy. So Midnight Basketball was something that really fit his interests. And so he partnered with he was part of a group that worked with the Chicago Housing Authority to launch several Midnight Basketball leagues in Chicago in 1989 and 90. It was really at that moment that the leagues really took off in terms of national publicity and attention. Within a few short years, there was dozens of leagues around the country. And in particularly, sponsored, this was during first George Bush presidency, and it was part of his 1,000 Points of Light initiative. It was kind of thought of as a compassionate kind of conservatism. And so this was a signature program for the Bush administration of a new approach to social intervention, public policy, and crime prevention. On the screen, there's a picture of Bush at one of the first events, and then also a partial screenshot there, a partial shot of the cover of my book on the topic. I should say my book was really based on, I'll go back. My book is based on kind of history of the origins of this program, a lot about the politics that surrounded the program in the 1990s. And then the last third of the book is based on ethnographic field work I did with programs in different places around the country, but especially focused here in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis program wasn't an official Midnight Basketball League, but it was using many of those principles, as do many sports-based initiatives, at the time and since. Some of the unique characteristics of Midnight Basketball as a crime prevention program. I think, first of all, I wanted to just mention that there's a long history of sport-based social interventions in the United States for communities of color, for immigrants, for working class folks. This history goes back at least to the turn of the previous century, the early 1900s, and the progressive era play movement, which was a series of playgrounds and sports and exercise opportunities that were really intended to provide and help assimilate working class and people of color at that moment. There's a long history of those kind of programs through the YMCA, Boys and Girls Clubs, police athletic leagues, etc. What's really important about Midnight Basketball, there's a couple of unique characteristics, I should say, about Midnight Basketball. One is it really centered not just social intervention, but crime prevention. A second aspect, and these are the points on the screen, at least I hope you can see those, is that there were really a blend of liberal and conservative ideas and ideals about sport. Many of the sport-based initiatives over the years really were kind of liberal oriented in terms of trying to socialize and promote development among youth, And this program was also then about crime prevention. And that's partly why it was late at night. There was an emphasis on having a police presence and some aspects like that, that really then it was a blend of kind of liberal character building dimensions of sport and more kind of recent policing kind of ideas about controlling, containing, and surveilling young men at the kind of moments perceived to be as high crime. Another thing that was really important about these is they were really intended under the Bush administration as public-private partnerships. So they weren't supposed to be hugely publicly funded, but rather much more about a limited public investment together with local organizations and voluntary associations. Two other things that were really unique about midnight basketball as a form of sports-based crime prevention and intervention. One was the age range. These were targeted at young men between 17 and 21 or 22 or 23 years old. That's actually a little bit older than most sports-based interventions were before that and even are today. And I think there's good things and bad things about that, but it was a really deliberate attempt to target older teenagers and young adults as the target population, and then also race. Clearly, this initiative was built on the idea about basketball having a unique appeal for young Black men. I want to say just a little bit more about that. I'll just pause for a moment to make sure everything's going good here, and if there's any questions that I should address before I move on. All right, I'll go ahead and
good. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go ahead and keep going. It's always a little tricky on Zoom here to make sure everybody's tracking and also that I'm making sense. Okay, so the deep racialization is what I want to talk about here briefly. These programs were rarely talked about in racial terms, but they're completely predicated on assumptions about race, and in particular, young Black men. And in the book, I described this at some length, but in particular, these, at the time, late 1980s and 90s, maybe not unlike today, but at the time for sure, there was two dominant tropes or stereotypes of Black men. One was superstar athletes, the other was super predator criminals. Standifer's genius and the Midnight Basketball League in general, what was kind of the brilliant synthesis of it was it put the romanticized, seemingly positive stereotypes about Black men as great athletes in service of the presumed pathologies of young Black men as super predator criminals. But what I want you to see from the outset, well, I guess there's two things to say. One is this wasn't ever very explicit. It wasn't directly said. It was kind of colorblind language that was used, though it was clearly signaled in all the promotional materials. And the whole idea of it, of basketball itself, was predicated on these assumptions and beliefs about young Black men and the kind of cultural things that they really believed in and loved to participate in. That becomes really important in the context of the 1994 crime bill. The 1994 crime bill is a real watershed moment for midnight basketball leagues. It started, the crime bill, this is now, Bill Clinton was elected president in 92. He had a penchant for kind of finding broader syntheses, kind of bipartisan programs that he thought could appeal across the usual party lines. And midnight basketball was one of them. He saw midnight basketball as a kind of a program that liberals and conservatives could unite around. And so he made it a very big part of the publicity and promotion for the new crime bill that he was championing at the time. This bill was passed late in the summer of 1994, a $33 billion bill that reshaped American criminal justice policy, that gave us many of the increases in prisons and policing that have become so problematic and disconcerting in our day to day. But at the time, it was not only about prisons and police, it was also trying to champion a more, kind of complementary, more preventative, proactive approach to crime. And so that's what Clinton really used midnight basketball for, was to signal that. And midnight basketball for Clinton then became a symbol of this kind of new liberal democratic approach to crime. At first, it started to seem to work, but then in the summer of 1994, conservatives began to attack the bill, the Clinton bill, for being too liberal, for putting too much money into prisons and not enough too much money into prevention and not enough into prisons and police. And conservatives, led by radio talk show host Rush Limbaugh, hit on the idea of using midnight basketball as a symbol of everything that was wrong with liberal democratic crime policy. And I have actually 2 full chapters on this in the book, because what's so important is that midnight basketball, it was a tiny program. Even in the bill, it was at most going to get $30 million, which is a drop in the bucket of a $33 billion plan. But it got an inordinate amount of attention in the halls of Congress and in the media coverage. And really, I think, served as a symbol, and I would say even more than that, a racially coded symbol that let Republicans attack the crime bill, but also that was built on Democratic assumptions about who criminals were and what kinds of programs that they needed. In the end, the kind of attacks on the crime bill through midnight basketball ended up kind of hollowing out the bill a little bit, took out at least $3 billion of the prevention monies that Democrats had originally built in. So it definitely kind of was a decrease of prevention-oriented funding to the kind of exclusion, or on the other side, the increase of prisons and police. But what's really important is the kind of symbolic role that midnight basketball played here. Now, I can't go way into that. I will say, though, there's a great HBO and Vox in this last fall released a new documentary series called Level Playing Field. And the first episode of that is all about midnight basketball, the 1994 crime bill debates. So I've got the link here. I can put that in the chat later if you're interested as well. Hour-long program that really brings to light and really illustrates and shows kind of the points that I'm making here about the role that midnight basketball played in impacting federal crime policy for now several decades. Just heads up, I'm one of the talking heads in there, and I spent some time working with the producers, so it's very much that part of the story is very much the story that I try to tell in my book, but I think they bring it to life in a way that's a little more vivid and easily accessible if you're interested in that. All right, I should check where I'm at on time here. I'm going to try to speed it up. I have 2 more things I want to talk about before we get to the Q&A, and I'm hoping the Q&A and the conversation can be extensive and really pick up on some of the points I'm making here, or can add some other questions and angles that would be good to talk about. The big set of things I want to talk about, tee up for us here, is the kind of policy implications of midnight basketball and my work on midnight basketball. A couple big questions that I always get, and I think some of you may have. One is, does midnight basketball work? We could talk about that. I think part of the issue there is just, what do we mean by work? What do we mean by success? Many different definitions of that. Number 2 is, what are the key components and principles that underlie midnight basketball and that can presumably account for positive impacts and success? Another way to put this, someone like a sociologist like me might say it, is, under what conditions are such initiatives likely to thrive? And for me here, this is not only about basketball-based programs, but all kinds of sports-based interventions. And then the third thing I want to remind us of, and always not lose sight of, is what are the problems or downsides of these programs? It's a little bit of a downer to always have to do that, but that sociology is all about thinking about problems and the problems we sometimes create by trying to solve problems. So those are the 3 things I hope you're thinking about. And then if you've got some other questions, I'm happy to deal with those too. But just to give you some preliminary answers, in terms of the problems and the downsides. First, to me, is all about the things I've already touched on a little bit about the embedded racism and racialization in the program. This is a program, it's what's distinct about midnight basketball from other sports-based initiatives, that was firmly embedded and based in racist and racialized assumptions about Black men. Even when you think about the 94 crime bill, there was polarization. Democrats had one version of that bill and Republicans had another. But one thing they all agreed on, and this is why midnight basketball is so symbolically convenient for them, is that Black men were the root of the race problem. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think it's stereotypical, stigmatizing, and inappropriate, but very much so that's what's built in to the kind of the whole idea of the program is based around that. Another thing I think that's important and problematic about all kinds of sports-based programs is that they often overestimate the power of sport, even as they underestimate the depth of social problems that they're trying to address. I could say a lot about that. I'll let you ponder that a little bit, but it's this kind of paradox that it overestimates what sport can do to solve problems, whether it's crime prevention or poverty alleviation or education. It overestimates how much sports can do and then underestimates how difficult it is to address social problems. And then the third is the broader symbolic functions that these sports-based programs can serve. In the book, I characterized Midnight Basketball as at one point as a commercial for neoliberal social policies and policing. It worked as a commercial in a couple of ways. It popularized the programs, but part of what that also did, it was distracted people from the larger social problems in these communities and the transformation, retrenchment, and disinvestment of social services that's been happening in our country since the 1980s. This is in a lot of ways what neoliberal social policy has been all about. Not only that, not only does it distract us from the fundamental disinvestment of public resources, but then these programs, because they often are very popular and they get a lot of great media attention, they can serve to justify or legitimate the social racial status quo. So not only do we forget about all the problems and that we have stopped investing in it, we convince ourselves, because we think these initiatives are so interesting and exciting and innovative, that everything is fine, that we don't need to pay further attention to social change, to the problems with policing and our criminal justice system more generally. So that's kind of the broader symbolic functions I think we always have to be aware of when we're thinking about any kind of programs that get a lot of media attention and seem popular in one way or another. And this will be the last slide I have on this point. I think it's really important to understand Midnight Basketball, as well as all kinds of social interventions and crime prevention initiatives in the context of the current neoliberal context that we live in, a context that is limited funding and cutbacks in other social services and resources, that it also, I think, has, when to the extent we can put money in, it's been money into criminal justice and more police and more prisons, rather than more basic social services and needs. And so it's important to understand sports-based interventions, Midnight Basketball, and any others in the context of this situation. They're not in a vacuum. They're part of a larger social policy climate and initiative that has cut back on social services and pumped up the prisons, policing, and criminal justice side of our social services systems. And not only that, it often makes sports seem like this magic bullet, this easy fix way that we're going to do fundamental social change. All right. Let's see here. I think I might have, well, I think there was one slide I meant to hit. I'm just going to see if I might have lost that. I did. I lost the slide that is supposed to be the positive things here. So I'll just tell you those, like some of the positive lessons about Midnight Basketball. One is about the ability for basketball and sports to be a hook into other social programs. But what I often say then is it's important to realize that sport can't do it alone. So sport is only the starting point. So usually when I talk about programs that are good or can be successful, what I try to emphasize is the non-sport aspects of any program. And when we look at the programs that seem to be successful in terms of intervention or prevention, it's usually not the sports program that's doing the good stuff. It's all the other programs and resources around sports. So it's the educational components, or the opportunities for job training, or just the resources made available for family conflict support or drug prevention. The non-sports stuff is typically where the real changes happen. And so that's why I also put a lot of emphasis when we're talking about, I shouldn't have that slide up, I'm talking about sport-based social interventions, of how those interventions can kind of combine with and collaborate with and partner with other existing programs and resources in a neighborhood or community. Nothing can do it on its own. And it's when those partnerships and combinations happen to combine resources in support of communities that are disadvantaged and marginalized and discouraged, that's when good things are most likely to happen. And I could, I've done some other work on that to support those points. So that's kind of the main points. One other thing I'll say, the other thing that sports-based programs are really good for is health and fitness and recreation. And that's kind of ironic and counterintuitive for a lot of folks, because a lot of folks that have supported these programs over the years support them not as sports programs, not as health and fitness, but as social intervention, crime prevention. And while I understand that, I think it's also important to remember that these are actual human beings who need real resources for health and fitness as well. And that's another thing that we've often seen cut back in a lot of neighborhoods and communities, is their recreational opportunities and community facilities. So even though a lot of times we've launched these programs for other purposes, some of the things they're most successful at is just basic provision of opportunities for health and fitness. Okay, I'll just say a bit then to wrap up and open up about the final bullet point. And this is the new project I'm working on right now. There's a ton I could say about this, so you can ask me more about it if you'd like. The project really is about the resurgence of especially race-based athletic activism in the United States in the last decade. And you see some pictures of this here, stretching from LeBron James after Trevion Martin's case, to the Minnesota Lynx here in my hometown that spoke out when Philando Castillo was killed, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, all the other scenes there. I could say a ton about that, but I think all I want to say right now is to connect it back to our larger topic. And it's to make the point about how much contemporary athletic activism and Black Lives Matter protest grows out of an engagement with and a resistance to the criminal justice system and police brutality at its core. And that's important to see that context, to see how many athletes are motivated to speak out, to use the platform of sport to call attention not only to generic racial injustices, but to criminal system injustice and police brutality. And I guess the point I'll make to wrap my formal remarks here is so much of this goes back to the policies and politics of the 1990s and the creation of a criminal justice system that is grown and expanded massively, and that in doing that has really put a tremendous amount of the resources on prisons and police that have had terrible effects on young Black men, on the Black community, and our communities more generally. So I guess my point is, when we think about contemporary athletic activism, to see that that's rooted in some of the same history and structure and struggles that Midnight Basketball gave rise to back in the 90s. Okay, I probably talked a little bit longer than expected or planned, but I kind of actually figured that. So I'll wrap up there and stop screen sharing and hopefully open it up now to some questions, comments, and hopefully a larger discussion and commentary.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hartman. If you would, since this forum is open to the public, could you kind of give us some context? You talk about compassionate conservatism and neoliberal policy. I think to the general public, neoliberalism, neoconservatism are kind of interchangeable terms. You do explain it in the book a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, compassionate conservatism was quite literally the kind of movement that George Bush tried to create that I think was connected to neoliberalism, but can't be reduced to it. It was, in the early 90s, it was the 1,000 Points of Light Foundation that was really trying to emphasize grassroots, community-based programs and initiatives as the solution to large-scale public problems. the connection to neoliberalism is partly that kind of grassroots-based public partnership problems approach. But the larger thing that neoliberalism is about is the shift towards market-based solutions more generally for public policy. So means testing, programs that had to show evidence of their effectiveness, that had to show cost-effective metrics. And that was really, I would say, what the Clinton administration really ramped up and jumped onto in the 1990s, was getting away from kind of state-based social services and just public provision, and more towards market-oriented public services and social services. And so that's where kind of the market, that these programs had to pay for themselves, and the government became more of a funder and regulator of programs rather than a direct provider of programs. And then the other point I guess I should make here, reiterate, is what that meant in practice also was the retrenchment of a lot of public investments in social services. And then I think the unfortunate other side was the rise of public policy investments around criminal justice and welfare state kind of issues, some of the social services that I think originally were envisioned to help urban settings and Black communities, and then really came to have almost the opposite effects as these programs, as the public investments were cut back and the market logic took shape. Does that help? I probably going to give it a little bit more of that along the way. I'm sorry.
No, that helps.
On the same line, could you, before we get into Q&A and so on, could you please talk about the downfall of the program?
So the downfall of the program, well, it's a little tricky. I mean, basically after 94, the programs became almost pariah in some ways, but in particular, conservatives abandoned those programs. So it wasn't like the programs went away, either in the 90s or today. There's still dozens of these initiatives and hundreds more copycats in other sports all around the country. But what really happened after the 94 crime bill debates was they kind of got reinvented in the more liberal, more traditional liberal context. So a lot of the policing and crime prevention angles got de-emphasized, and it was more kind of traditional character building, resources and services for the men who participated in the program. And then the other big thing was it really made everyone kind of get scared of doing any kinds of services for older teenagers and young Black men. So really the big shift after the 90s was that sports-based programming really targeted on younger kids and younger teenagers. If you think back to like the second George Bush administration, they did a lot on after school programs, right, and sports was a big part of that, but it was really then targeted to school age kids rather than older teenagers or young adult men. And again, most of those were a little more of what I would call a more traditional liberal orientation, where it wasn't so much crime oriented and a little more about socialization, social skills, social development, and those kind of things. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Mary, you had a question?
Yes, kind of a statement and a question. Thank you so much, Dr. Hartman, for that eye-opening introduction to, well, I guess sports programs in general. I am intrigued. I think you're the first person that I have heard say out loud that Bill Clinton was not necessarily the best person in terms of, he wasn't all that liberal when it came to crime, or his ideas were a little off track, thinking that if you put more people in jail, if you build more prisons. Anyway, I first read that from the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander. She points that out. So could you maybe expand on that and talk about a little bit more about what Clinton's goals were? Did he really want to just lock up everyone, or was that just the natural outcome?
Yeah, I don't think he wanted to lock up everyone by any stretch. I think he was trying to do a version of in the late 1980s and 90s, the new Democrat politics, where they were trying to distance themselves from the big welfare state politics of the 70s and the post-civil rights 70s and 80s, and also win over kind of moderate Republican voters. And so to do that, what Clinton did, he did this not only for crime, but welfare reform, all kinds of programming, where he was trying to kind of carve out this middle ground, where it was kind of balancing traditional democratic concerns with more resources and support to neighborhoods, but also speak to traditional Republican concerns about cost containment and about crime and welfare. And so he tried to kind of have it both ways. And I actually think quite literally that was the intent of the 94 crime bill debate. It was to kind of do both at the same time and then kind of trump the Republicans and their initiatives and satisfy Democrats as well. And so the first thing I'd say about that, and I'm mentioning, glad you mentioned Alexander's book on the new Jim Crow, is how much Clinton's vision of that, and especially for crime, but also welfare, was predicated on assumptions about Black communities, Black culture, and Black men. And it kind of ironically, probably unintentionally, but quite clearly stigmatized and stereotyped Black men as the problem to be dealt with. On the welfare side, it was usually Black women. But it was all of those racialized, or I might even say racist assumptions, were built into these programs. And I would say part of why he stumbled into that, who was somebody who always tried to champion himself as this friend of the Black community. I think how he stumbled into that was trying to make these programs and his larger political agenda palpable to moderate middle-class Republicans. And that was the unfortunate play, was, kind of to make it seem more palpable. He played off of some really deep and problematic racial stereotypes. I don't think I'm the first one to say this. I mean, maybe I'd say it kind of a little bit more out loud, but this whole thing came back, when Hillary Clinton was running for president. And this was very, Midnight Basketball had a kind of a little resurgence there, but it was a resurgence attacking her and her husband for having done these programs that had this kind of deep underlying racial bias and structure. And so it's something that a certain wing of the Democratic Party has always done and had to contend with and had to figure out how they're going to negotiate that. But I really do feel like as polarized as the 90s were, and even as we are today, one of the things that there's an unfortunate amount of consensus about is that Black folks are the problem. And that's a racist thing. But I think there's a consensus, especially in the 90s, as divided as folks were, that was something that Democrats and Republicans could agree on. They had really different solutions to that, but they could agree on that. And then the thing about Midnight Basketball, it let everybody kind of go through that dance without really openly acknowledging their racism and directly saying it's Black men. They never had to say it because that's what was signaled in the term Midnight Basketball, in the images that were circulated. And that's why it's really scary. Like so much of racism is something that's like right there in front of us, but then also it doesn't get acknowledged. It's like, that's, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, the sociologist, has the notion of colorblind racism. And I think this is one variation of that, where it's deeply racialized, but then also appears to be like color neutral or race neutral. Does that make sense, Mary, with how you were thinking about things?
Yeah, and I think that's a theme that it has been happening, probably for all of our history. But I remember when Reagan began the whole conversation about welfare queens, giving the example of the woman who had, 20 Cadillacs or whatever. But there's always that it's understood. It's understood. But yes, that makes a lot of sense. But I'm also thinking that Clinton is following two very conservative presidents, Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and so he couldn't do you really think that he was thinking that he was doing a liberal thing?
Well, the reason why I do is because he was also trying to build up the prevention-oriented dimensions of the criminal justice system. So the more proactive community building,
Yes.
policing, and he, was really trying to do that and working with like the Black Caucus to do that. And they did have a lot of funding in that. And so in a lot of ways, the initial version of that bill was a balancing act of prisons and police funding on the one hand, and then community support and proactive intervention and new versions of policing on the other. And Clinton, that's part of why he was so into midnight basketball. He was using midnight basketball to sell two cities and two Black Black Democrats, the prevention side of the plan. And I think to a certain extent, and he made appearances in big cities with gospel choirs and basketball players. And it really was, I think was genuinely trying to bring in a new resources and new models for our social services systems. But he was doing that always at the cost of trying to balance the other side, trying to appeal to whites and moderates on the other side by building up the far more detrimental and controlling parts of the House. And then that's, to me, one of the stories of midnight basketball and the crime bill was how that kind of backfired and how Republicans then really used that against him to carve out. It's not like prevention went away, but it got whittled down a little bit because of the attacks on midnight basketball.
I don't want to take up any more of your time. Thank you so much. I know we have some questions, don't we, Stan?
We do, and
Thank you, Doug.
And you talk about the stereotype, Dr. Hartman, and the first question is, how are the outlooks so different being no in between, either superstar or criminal? And I will say this about when I was involved. When I was involved, there was an officer who was in charge of the program, and he was a really talented basketball player. So he would show up in a basketball attire, and he would play with the men, because they weren't boys, they were men.
That's right.
And so he would play, but the other officers that were there saw it as an opportunity to take names and get pictures of these Black men who they believed on their day off were causing crime. So the stereotype and the actualization of the program kind of got watered down, because one of the things that when I was there, they hated signing in. They did not want their name on a clipboard. So discuss the one end or the other end, because there were superstars that were involved in this program.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say a lot of the programs that were most important and best weren't really about superstar, weren't even about high level basketball. I mean, it was a recreational thing that had other programming built around it. I saw the same thing you saw. Folks hated signing in. They didn't like police being there. They didn't like all these rules they were supposed to follow. Like in terms of attire, and they felt controlled. I guess I will say, and so for sure after the crime bill debates, a lot of that did go away, because that like the kind of more conservative controlling elements of the program, because there wasn't as much conservative Republican support anymore, so that went away to a certain extent. But it's a what do I want to say about that? It's always kind of there. I mean, it was always kind of built into that. Maybe I'll say it like this. I think when there's an alternative model of those programs that I think the ones that have lasted and been successful do, that isn't about control at all, but it's about relationship building. It's tied with kind of newer models of community relations and showing connections to the community and providing resources and support. So to me, kind of like we were talking about with Clinton a little bit ago, there's kind of a really problematic side of these programs. And then there's another side of it that is about community building, relationship building, providing resources in neighborhoods and communities. And I guess that's the part of sports-based intervention I would want to pull out, preserve, and build on. To use these programs not to control, not to identify, but rather to help people, and build relationships that might not happen otherwise. And that might be relationship within the community. It might be with social service workers or even some law enforcement folks, but it takes a different mindset than the programs as they were constituted originally.
Yeah, thank you. And another question that says, on a personal story participants level, what are 3 most positive changes you saw with the players? And I will say this, in my town, one of the big things that they concluded was on Wednesday night, when midnight basketball was being played, the crime level dropped. Because not only were the players at midnight basketball, but so were the people that came out to watch it.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that community engagement, I think. Yeah, so I've done a little bit of research on this. Before I get to the individual level, I'll speak at the community level. I do think in the 90s, there was an association between cities that had midnight basketball leagues and lower crime rates. I actually don't think that was only or directly about midnight basketball. I think what was happening is that in those communities, midnight basketball was one of a whole package of programs and initiatives that cities were launching that helped to both bring down crime rates, but also to just provide more services and proactive support in those neighborhoods. So that's kind of one of my big takeaways on this, is the role that when those programs work, it's in concert with a lot of other initiatives. And that's another, at a more individual level, I would say usually the success stories of individuals in those programs, it's not like it's a magic bullet per se, but when they're successful, it's because they're getting connected with other, they're not like completely immediately transforming their lives, but they're getting connected with other resources. And that could be resources for their personal health and mental health, for their family relationships, or even like education and jobs trainings kind of programs. And that's, to me, what I tend to think about for all kinds of interventions, sport-based interventions, again, is not the sport per se, but all the other things that sport can hook the participants into. And then the last thing I'll say, we don't usually fund these for recreation and fitness, but in a world where everything is privatized and expensive, it's really hard for kids from a lot of these communities, or young men from these communities, to find opportunities for recreation and fitness. And that's provided. I think that's a success story that we don't want to lose sight of, even though it's often not the reason the programs are funded and created in the first place.
And they unchained the basketball courts, which was amazing. So they were open. Go ahead, Matt. You jump in there, Matt.
I had a question about racial coding, because you introduce a character that we all came to know, unfortunately, very well, Rush Limbaugh. And in the book, you mentioned, this wasn't just something that happened between the politicians. There was a PR war that happened.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. You want, like, are you wanting me to talk about the specific racial part of it?
Yes, please. Yeah, and
so,
kind of how it got into the public consciousness, the public conversation.
So really, what Limbaugh did, and then Republican strategists quite literally picked up on this, was he started kind of making fun of midnight basketball as an example of everything that was wrong with liberal democratic crime policies. And he would talk about, I mean, it was obvious that he was talking about black men, young black men. But he would talk about like how ludicrous it was to roll basketballs out to criminals. And we're just giving them fun and games. And we already know they're threatening. We already know they're destroying our cities. And now all you're doing is giving them more money to play games and coordinate together and get together and create problems. So it was like a laugh line, though. Like, it was like how preposterous it was that you would think that giving sports or recreation to these supposed criminals, again, code black men, how crazy that idea was. I guess I should remind everybody, part of the problem was, or part of the thing was, remember, it was Republicans that had started it. I mean, so it kind of had to really have amnesia about where the programs originally came from. But also then how it really did play off of these stereotypes, and then also built up this supposed idea that we were just giving away money, public money, like without any attention to the kind of things that really needed to be done. And then in the backstage of these racial codes was also the assumption that what we really needed to do was round people up, was lock them up, was we needed prisons, we needed police, we needed containment and surveillance. And so that was kind of Midnight Basketball. He didn't have to talk about that. He just made fun of the idea of prevention, the idea of getting resources and social support in neighborhoods that are otherwise devastated became a punchline and a joke. Is that kind of what you had in mind? Or
yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind, and I think it leads to our next question, Stan.
Yeah, with nuts and bolts.
Yes.
Yeah, can you talk about the nuts and bolts of this? How would Midnight Basketball work? Who would participate? Who would play? Who would coach? How would people hear about it? And who were attracted to the program and why?
Right. Yeah, so this is a kind of a big question to answer in just a minute or two. But I'll say a little bit about it. And I also want to preface it by saying, I think there's kind of resurgence to some of these ideas right now. I'm getting a lot of phone calls again about people in different cities who are attracted to the idea of Midnight Basketball or other kind of sports-based programming. And one of the reasons is because it does seem kind of cost efficient. It seems cheap, it seems innovative. But typically these programs were started real grassroots oriented. So voluntary organizations or service groups on the ground that maybe have a history of doing sports-based intervention or sports would kind of look for opportunities to kind of not only do their sports programming, but to connect with other social services and resources. I didn't say much about this yet. There's a lot in the book. I think one of the drivers of this, in fact, was people who are trying to do community-based sports and recreation, who are getting systematically cut and defunded in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Were just doing everything they could to try to keep their programs alive, like to have some facilities. And that often required having like writing grant applications that put the priority not just on the sports, but on social intervention or crime prevention. I think we still are seeing that today. It's almost always the case when I'm talking to people today who are thinking about these initiatives. They often have a kind of a sports background, but they also know that you can't get sports funded, especially in urban areas. So what you can get funded is other kinds of programming that uses sport. So that's kind of, these programs are often built on this kind of coalition of people who are in communities trying to help folks out, and people who have sports experience and know-how and see sport as a attractive thing to bring young kids, young men into programming because it's something they like in a way that's different from some of the other social services that might be the outreach. One thing I often say, I don't know if this is directly nuts and bolts, it's more of a principle, but a lot of times people are attracted to these programs because they think they're going to be cheaper and easier than doing other kinds of social services. And I usually argue exactly the opposite. I think doing sports-based social intervention is like harder because you have to be really good at running a sports program, which isn't that easy because you got to know how to teach skills, you got to get referees, you got to get, there's all kinds of things about doing sports, health and fitness. You got to know how to do that. And then you also have to know how to be a social worker, how to be a service, how to work in the service industry, how to do social programs. And so to run these programs really well, you got to do both the sports stuff really well and the social intervention stuff really well. So I think it's not a magic bullet. I don't think it's easier. I think it's a little harder. But I do think what these programs can do is bring together lots of resources, organizations, and people in communities they can bring together those folks to work in service of young people who are looking for some way to connect in society and looking for ways to find not just recreation and fitness, but access to social and public services. And that's when they can work. But it's a hard road to go. And it's not one that's easy and outside of all the other initiatives that we've got. The one other thing I'd say there, I think it also, in the kind of context of policing and prisons, et cetera, I think we also need to think about orientations towards policing that move toward more community-based service provision, toward more proactive, preventative types of programming and resources, and get away from the assumptions about crime, about criminals already being criminals, and think more about these folks as human beings who are looking for ways to build their lives, and that we need programming that does that, not about control, containment, and prisons.
Let me ask one more question, and says, how passive or active in their own growth and development are the players? How much of themselves did they invest in the program? I will tell you, just following your response just now, our program got huge. It got big and out of control. And what happened was we had people coming every week, and they would bring their friends to play and so on. And each team was trying to have a better team than the other team. And so, I mean, there were guys coming in there that we didn't even, they were 6'7". We're like, where'd that guy come from? And so on. So the competition got, I mean, it got vicious. And so that's why I wasn't a rep anymore, because it was getting pretty rough. But how much investment did the athletes put in? Because they weren't criminals. The groups that I saw, we had some that were street people, but in the general, a lot of these players were local boys that wanted to get better at basketball and saw it as good competition.
Well, I'm thinking about how you frame that, and that kind of seems familiar to me, that these programs can get too big and too competitive and too specialized. And I think that's absolutely right, and absolutely one of the dangers you have to be careful about with these programs, because end of the day, the ideas that draw many people to them and the funding to them are not about the sports. Sports really is a tool or a hook for other social initiatives, other resources. And I think they require that kind of understanding, and not just balancing act, but orientation, not towards sport as the end or the focus, but really as a means towards some other kinds of resources and initiatives. And it's just like high school sports or college sports. If you put too much emphasis on the sports and you lose the emphasis on academics and learning, that's a misbalance. Things are getting out of whack. Same thing can happen with sports-based interventions, that too much attention on the success of the athletes or the athletic side of it can make people lose sight of the other initiatives. And that brings me then to your specific thing. I think that has to be built. You have to convince people of that. You have to educate them about that. And I'm saying the coaches, the referees, but also the players. They have to be kind of reminded that, yeah, we're here because we like basketball. It's going to be a fun experience, but we're also trying to accomplish some other things. And I think good programs, good coaches, good program designers have to be attentive to framing the initiative that way, to making it clear that it's not just about sports and fun and being big and competitive. It's actually trying to do a lot of other social interventions as part of that. And I do think that can't be taken for granted. That has to be created, because too often sports-based initiatives devolve only into sports. And that typically isn't where a lot of the important interventions can happen. It doesn't happen automatically, I should say.
Yeah, and I will say this, our orientation at the beginning of our program was started with a prayer. I mean, we had 40 kids lined up, all ready for the prayer, and then it would be the orientation on why we're here and what we're doing. And but they were there, they were there to play ball. And I'm gonna let Matt ask the last question. So Matt, go ahead.
So I think just to kind of put a bow on the top, the last question I have, I know that there are still some midnight basketball leagues, quote unquote, that in existence. There is still an organization that G. Van Standiff, her son, is running. But how do we fit the experience of the Midnight Basketball League, the sports and the social aspects, social services aspects of it? How do we fit that into this ongoing conversation between race and policing?
Right. Boy, that's ending with the big one. A good question. There is a lot, there's, still official leagues around. I'd say even there's hundreds, maybe even thousands of copycat kind of programs around where we've got folks using sports-based interventions in a lot of ways, all over the country. I think my answer to that, where does it fit with respect to policing? And I think it's to put the emphasis on not sports, but on using sports to do new kinds of interventions, building up communities, social services, even modes of policing that aren't about arrests or imprisonment, but are about building relationships and building up communities. I do think that if we strip out some of the control aspects that the original Midnight Basketball programs were built on and try to humanize the participants and think about what they want and need, not only in terms of their sports, not only in terms of how they sit in our communities, but just what they need in their lives to be successful. I think that's where sports-based initiatives can start to make a change and start to be, but again, it's not on their own. It's in connection with other proactive community building resources, programs, and initiatives that those changes would need to happen. I think if we don't think about how it's related, how a sports-based initiative is related to all kinds of other resources or resource problems and programs that are in existence or not in existence, you run the danger of romanticizing sport and creating only a sport program that I think actually can do as much harm as it can do good, if not for the individuals in the program, then for the ways that these programs get used by people in power and people with privilege to forget about all the other problems and act like we already are addressing them just because we've given them basketball a couple nights a week. So I guess that's my answer, is to see any sports-based initiative as more proactive and preventative, and also to see it in relationship and partnership with all kinds of other resources. It can't be in a vacuum. So it's part of a whole range of initiatives of rethinking not only policing in our communities, but social services and community support and building resources and rebuilding communities, neighborhoods with the resources that they need to combat all the terrible things that have happened in these communities and that we've done to these communities over the last decades.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mary?
Yes, last question, I think. Can you just take out the politics, take out race, and if they were just listening to social scientists, what would be the best crime prevention program?
Well, I mean, I would
What
say,
would it look like?
I think, I mean, if you're asking me or allowing me to be utopian about this,
Yes,
I mean,
exactly. Because that's what social scientists are, right? We're
it's-
utopian.
it's jobs, it's better schools,
Yeah.
it's resources. It's the resources that any human being needs and any community needs to live in a world that is expensive and complicated and requires a lot of us. And that's, so I think it's completely connected with what we need to invest in to support each other and to support each other equally across the society. And so that's part of why, my book is pitched in relationship to neoliberal culture and policy, where we've created a society and criminal justice systems that are all about money and markets, that fundamentally disinvest in people who aren't with a lot of money, or who are at the bottom of the hierarchy. And I think that's a big part of, I mean, it's not the only thing that explains crime and crime prevention, but it's a big part of what we need to do right by folks and bring crime rates down, but also just to move away from thinking about social services and resource prevention as only about containment and control, like with welfare or criminal justice. Like to think about other social services that folks need to live their lives. You know, it might even be about healthcare, like making that available to folks, independent of what their economic status is or whether they have jobs or not. So, I mean, that's my simple utopian answer is let's do right by everyone and do more to support and provide the resources of support in communities that are otherwise marginalized and disadvantaged by the ravages and inequities of a fundamentally capitalist culture.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hartman, for being here with us today. And Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we look forward to maybe seeing you again after your next book comes out, and we can hit that one too, and enjoy the knowledge that you bring to us. Thank you for the students for being here with us each and every week, and we will see you next week. Thank you very much.
Can I just say that I'm really intrigued about, because I think you mentioned your upcoming book has to do with race and sports and colleges. I'd really love to hear something about that, because you know that has been the NCAA is not doing the right thing.
Yeah, I mean that's a whole nother thing. I'm happy to talk about those things. I would say it's not only colleges; it's just all over the sports system. The kind of protest, activism, and resistance that we've seen, and I think that stems not only from racism in society, but also racism, exploitation within our athletic institutions, and colleges and universities are a big part of that. So, hey, I'm happy to come back and talk another time about some of that. It's right up my alley.
Who would have thought that Colin Kaepernick had done the right thing?
Yeah.
Who would have thought? You know.
Hey, you know.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks,
remind everybody, he was a sociology major.
Yeah.
Well, why does that not surprise me? Come on now.
Now I feel outnumbered.
Thank you, everybody. We will see you next week.
Thanks again. Thanks, Ben. Bye.
Bye-bye.